Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive into history's most fascinating stories. I hope you're all having a wonderful day or evening, wherever you are in the world. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Whether you're settling in for the night, taking a break from work, or just looking for something captivating to listen to, you've come to the right place. Get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink. Dim the lights if you're winding down for the evening, and prepare yourself for one of the most extraordinary tales from ancient history. Today, we're going to explore the incredible story of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China, and his obsessive, decades-long quest to achieve something that no human being has ever accomplished: true immortality. This isn't just a story about power or conquest, though there's plenty of both. This is a story about what happens when the most powerful person in the world becomes consumed by the one thing that money, armies, and absolute authority cannot buy: the fear of death. But this emperor didn't just fear death. He actively tried to ban it from his empire, launching massive expeditions across dangerous seas to find magical elixirs, consulting with hundreds of alchemists and sorcerers, building monuments that would last forever, creating an entire underground empire for his afterlife, and ultimately making decisions that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives in his desperate attempt to cheat the inevitable. What makes this story even more remarkable is that we're not talking about some minor ruler or forgotten king. Qin Shi Huang was arguably one of the most influential figures in human history. The man who unified China for the first time built much of what we now call the Great Wall, standardized currency, writing systems, and measurements across his vast empire, created administrative systems that would influence Chinese government for over 2,000 years, and established a legacy that fundamentally shaped one of the world's great civilizations. Yet despite all of these incredible achievements, he became increasingly paranoid and obsessed with one singular goal that would ultimately consume his final years and lead to some of the most bizarre and tragic episodes in ancient history. So settle in for this epic journey as we uncover the incredible true story of the emperor who tried to ban death. A tale that will take us from the blood-soaked battlefields of ancient China to mysterious islands in search of immortal beings. From grand palaces filled with intrigue and assassination plots, to underground tombs guarded by thousands of terracotta soldiers, from the heights of absolute power to the depths of human obsession, and from the ancient world to modern times, as we explore how this emperor's impossible quest continues to fascinate and warn us about the dangers of power unchecked by wisdom. Our story begins in the year 259 BCE, during what historians call the Warring States period of ancient China, one of the most chaotic and violent eras in Chinese history. The land that would one day become the unified Chinese empire was divided into 7 major kingdoms, each constantly fighting for supremacy in a seemingly endless cycle of war, betrayal, and conquest. These weren't small city-states or minor principalities, but major powers with sophisticated armies, complex political systems, and millions of subjects. The warfare between them was brutal and total, with entire populations being enslaved or massacred when their cities fell. Into this world of endless warfare and political chaos was born a prince named Ying Zheng in the state of Qin, located in what is now northwestern China. From the very beginning, his life was marked by violence, uncertainty, and the constant threat of death. His father, King Zhongxiang of Qin, had come to power through political maneuvering and military conquest. But his reign was relatively short. When he died in 246 BCE, the boy was just 13 years old, leaving him to inherit a throne surrounded by enemies, both foreign and domestic. The young prince had to navigate a world where assassination attempts were as common as diplomatic meetings where today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy with a single change in political circumstances. where the slightest show of weakness could mean not just the loss of power, but the complete destruction of everything he held dear, including his own life and the lives of everyone in his family. But rather than being paralyzed by this environment of constant danger, young Ying Zheng seemed to thrive in it. From an early age, he displayed an unusual combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, charisma, and strategic thinking that would serve him well in the brutal world of ancient Chinese politics. He was physically imposing, according to historical accounts, standing taller than most men of his time and possessing a commanding presence that could intimidate enemies and inspire loyalty in followers. More importantly, he had an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations, to know when to be generous and when to be harsh, when to trust and when to suspect betrayal. By the time he reached his early 20s, he had not only survived the dangerous transition from child prince to adult king, but had consolidated power within his own kingdom and begun the incredibly ambitious project that would define his legacy: the conquest and unification of all of China under his personal rule. This wasn't just a matter of military conquest, though that was certainly part of it. The young king understood that lasting unification would require not just defeating his enemies, but creating new institutions, systems, and cultural practices that could bind together diverse peoples who had been fighting each other for centuries. What followed was a series of military campaigns that were both brilliant in their strategic conception and brutal in their execution. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, from 230 to 221 BCE, Ying Zheng's armies systematically conquered each of the rival kingdoms in a carefully planned sequence that prevented them from forming effective alliances against Qin, the state of Ah. Han fell first in 230 BCE, its capital besieged and captured after a campaign that demonstrated the superior organization and equipment of the Qin military. The conquest of Han was followed by Zhao in 228 BCE, a campaign that was particularly significant because Zhao had been one of Qin's most persistent enemies and had been responsible for several assassination attempts against the young king. The fall of Wei came in 225 BCE, accomplished through an innovative siege technique that involved diverting a river to flood the enemy capital. Chu, the largest of the rival states, fell in 223 BCE after a massive campaign that required multiple armies and several years of continuous warfare. Yan was conquered in 222 BCE, and finally, Qi surrendered without a fight in 221 BCE, recognizing that resistance was futile given the fate of the other kingdoms. With each victory, the young king's reputation grew not just as a military commander, but as someone who seemed to possess an almost divine mandate to rule. His soldiers began to see him as invincible. His enemies began to fear him as much as they hated him, and his own people began to view him as someone who had achieved something that no one before him had even attempted. But along with this growing reputation came an ever-increasing exposure to death and violence that would profoundly shape his psychological development. He had witnessed countless battles where thousands of men died in single afternoons. He had ordered the execution of tens of thousands of prisoners of war, reasoning that showing mercy would only encourage future resistance. He had seen entire cities destroyed in his name, their populations scattered or enslaved. He had watched trusted advisors and beloved friends die in battle, or fall victim to the diseases and accidents that claimed so many lives in the ancient world. Perhaps most significantly for his later obsession with immortality, he had survived numerous assassination attempts, each one bringing him face to face with his own mortality in the most visceral possible way. The most famous of these attempts occurred in 227 BCE, when an assassin named Jing Qi gained access to the king's presence during what was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting with representatives from the state of Yan. Jing Qi Ke had concealed a poisoned dagger in a map that he was presenting to the king, and when he unfurled the map, he grabbed the weapon and lunged at the future emperor. Only quick reflexes and a bit of luck saved the king's life as he dodged the blade and managed to draw his own sword to defend himself. The would-be assassin was killed, but the incident left a deep impression on the young ruler. For the first time, he had come within inches of death, not on a battlefield surrounded by his soldiers, but in his own palace, betrayed by someone he had trusted enough to allow into his presence. This experience, combined with several other near-death experiences during his campaigns, seems to have planted the seeds of the paranoia and obsession with mortality that would later consume his life. These experiences with death, both as something he inflicted on others and something that constantly threatened him, appear to have had a profound and lasting psychological impact on the future Emperor Dot, rather than becoming comfortable with mortality as a natural part of existence, or developing the kind of philosophical acceptance that many warriors and leaders of his time cultivated. He seems to have become increasingly disturbed by the randomness and inevitability of death. He had seen too many capable, intelligent, powerful people die suddenly and unexpectedly. He had witnessed too many cases where a single moment of bad luck or poor judgment could end a life that had taken decades to build and develop. He had observed how death made no distinctions between the brave and the cowardly, the just and the unjust, the wise and the foolish. By 221 BCE, when he finally achieved his goal of unifying China, Ying Zheng had seen more death and destruction than most people could imagine. But instead of becoming comfortable with mortality, these experiences appear to have made him more afraid of it, more determined to find some way to escape what seemed like an arbitrary and cruel fate that awaited everyone, regardless of their achievements or virtue. It was at this moment of supreme triumph, when he had accomplished something that no one before him had even dreamed of attempting, that he took on a new title that reflected his unprecedented achievement, Qin Shi Huang, which means First Emperor of Qin. This title wasn't just ceremonial or traditional. It represented his belief that he had fundamentally changed the nature of rulership, not just in China, but in the world. Previous kings had ruled over individual states or regions, but he was the first to rule over all of China as a unified empire. He was also the first to claim that his dynasty would last for 10,000 generations, essentially forever. The title Shi Huang literally means First Emperor, but it also implies that he was the beginning of an eternal line of rulers who would govern China until the end of time. This grandiose vision of eternal rule was already showing the first signs of his later obsession with immortality, even though at this point he was still focused primarily on earthly concerns and practical governance. He established a new capital at Xianyang, near modern-day Xi'an, and set about the massive task of organizing and standardizing his vast new domain. The challenges he faced were enormous. He was trying to unite peoples who had been enemies for centuries, who spoke different dialects, used different currencies, followed different laws, and maintained different cultural traditions. Many of these groups had every reason to hate and distrust the Qin state, which had conquered them through violence and shown little mercy to those who had resisted. Creating a unified empire from such diverse and hostile elements required not just military force, but also innovative, administrative solutions and cultural policies that could gradually bind these different groups together into a single people. His reforms were comprehensive, far-reaching, and remarkably successful in achieving their goals. He standardized the Chinese writing system, taking the many different scripts that had evolved in the various kingdoms and creating a single, unified form of written Chinese that could be understood by educated people throughout the empire. This was more than just a practical administrative measure. It was a fundamental step toward creating a unified Chinese culture and identity that transcended regional differences. He standardized currency, replacing the many different types of coins and tokens that had been used in the various kingdoms with a single imperial currency that facilitated trade and commerce across the entire empire. He standardized weights and measures, ensuring that a pound of grain or a yard of cloth meant the same thing whether you were in the far north or the deep south of the empire. He standardized the width of cart axles, which might seem like a minor detail, but was actually crucial for maintaining the extensive road network that connected different parts of the empire. Most famously, he ordered the construction and connection of defensive walls that would eventually become known as the Great Wall of China, though the structure we see today was largely built during later dynasties. These reforms demonstrated the emperor's remarkable understanding of what was needed to create a lasting unified empire, and most of them proved so successful that they continued to influence Chinese civilization for over 2,000 years. These were the actions of a supremely practical and forward-thinking ruler, someone who understood that lasting power required strong institutions, effective infrastructure, and cultural unity. His early years as emperor showed him to be not just a successful conqueror, but also a skilled administrator and visionary leader who could see beyond immediate military victory to the long-term requirements of stable governance. But even as he was building these monuments to his earthly reign and creating institutions that would outlast him by millennia, Qin Shi Huang was beginning to develop an increasingly uncomfortable relationship with the idea of his own mortality, and a growing preoccupation with finding ways to extend his life indefinitely. The emperor's first serious foray into the pursuit of immortality began around 219 BCE, just 2 years after his unification of China. By this time, he was in his late 30s, still relatively young and in good health, but apparently already beginning to worry about the passage of time and the eventual end of his remarkable reign. Several factors seem to have contributed to this growing preoccupation with mortality. First, having achieved something that no one before him had accomplished, he found the idea of leaving his great work unfinished to be increasingly unbearable. He had unified China, but there was still so much more he wanted to accomplish. Expanding the empire to include other lands, perfecting his administrative systems, building monuments and cities that would showcase the glory of his reign, and ensuring that his vision of Chinese civilization would be permanently established. The thought that he might die before completing these ambitious projects seems to have been deeply troubling to him. Second, his experiences with assassination attempts and the constant dangers of ruling had made him acutely aware of how fragile life could be, even for someone with his power and resources. He had seen too many capable people die suddenly and unexpectedly, and he knew that his own death would likely trigger a succession crisis that could undo everything he had accomplished. The more he thought about mortality, the more it seemed like a completely arbitrary and unfair limitation on his ability to complete his great work and ensure the permanent success of his empire. Third, he had begun to encounter individuals who claimed to possess knowledge of life-extending or immortality-granting substances and techniques. These weren't obvious charlatans or con artists, but educated men who presented themselves as scholars, philosophers, and researchers who had devoted their lives to understanding the deepest secrets of nature and human existence. Many of them were associated with Taoist traditions that emphasized harmony with natural forces and the possibility of achieving various forms of transcendence through proper knowledge and practice. Their claims seemed plausible enough, and their apparent sincerity was convincing to someone who was already predisposed to believe that sufficient knowledge and resources could overcome any obstacle. The imperial court soon became filled with these figures, each claiming to possess unique insights into the nature of life and death, and promising to help the emperor achieve his ultimate goal of ruling forever. One of the most influential of These advisors was a man named Su Fu, who claimed to have extensive knowledge of magical islands in the Eastern Sea, where immortal beings lived and where a special elixir of life could be obtained. Su Fu was apparently a skilled storyteller, as well as a convincing charlatan, and he told the emperor elaborate and detailed stories about these islands, describing them as paradises where people lived forever in perfect health and happiness, where the very air and water contained life-extending properties, and where ancient sages had discovered the secrets of immortality through centuries of careful study and experimentation. According to Su Fu's accounts, these islands were inhabited by beings who had transcended normal human limitations and achieved a state of existence that combined the best aspects of earthly life with the timeless perfection of the divine realm. He claimed that these immortal beings possessed not just eternal life, but also unlimited knowledge, perfect health, extraordinary abilities, and complete freedom from the concerns and limitations that plagued ordinary mortals. Most importantly for the emperor's purposes, Su Fu claimed that these immortal beings possessed an elixir or substance that could grant immortality to ordinary people, but that this substance could only be obtained through a carefully planned expedition that would require significant resources and the right combination of people and circumstances. The emperor was fascinated by these claims and authorized Su Fu to mount a major expedition to find these mystical islands and return with the secret of immortality. This wasn't a small or casual undertaking. Historical records suggest that Su Fu was given a fleet of ships, thousands of young men and women as crew members and potential colonists, vast amounts of supplies and provisions, and enormous quantities of gold, silver, and other treasures that could be used to trade with the immortal beings or to support the expedition during its potentially lengthy journey. The scale of this expedition was comparable to some of the major military campaigns that the emperor had launched during his conquest of China, representing a significant investment of the empire's resources and manpower in what was essentially a speculative venture based on the unverified claims of a single individual. The expedition set sail from the eastern coast of China sometime around 219 BCE, and Su Fu promised to return within a few years with the elixir of life that would grant the emperor the immortality he so desperately sought. The emperor waited eagerly for news of the expedition's progress, but months passed, then years, with no word from Su Fu or any of his followers. Rather than becoming discouraged by this lack of communication, the emperor seems to have become more determined and more convinced that the expedition was encountering difficulties that required additional support and resources. He authorized additional expeditions, some led by Su Fu's associates, and others by completely different individuals, who claimed to have alternative routes to the islands of immortality or knowledge of different sources of life-extending substances. Meanwhile, he began consulting with more and more alchemists, sorcerers, and self-proclaimed experts in the arts of longevity and immortality, each of whom offered different theories and methods for achieving eternal life. Some claimed that immortality could be achieved through the consumption of special substances derived from rare minerals, plants, or animals. Others argued that the secret lay in particular combinations of meditation, exercise, and dietary practices that would gradually transform the human body into something more durable and long-lasting. Still others claimed that immortality required the performance of specific rituals or ceremonies that would align the individual with cosmic forces and grant them access to supernatural sources of life energy. The emperor was willing to try almost anything that seemed to offer even a remote possibility of extending his life, and he began consuming various pills, powders, potions, and elixirs that were supposed to grant longevity or immortality. Historical records from this period describe the emperor taking mercury-based compounds, which were believed by many alchemists to possess life-extending properties, because mercury was a liquid metal that seemed to combine earthly and celestial characteristics. He also consumed various plant-based preparations, including some that contained what we now know to be highly toxic substances like arsenic, lead, and other heavy metals that were thought to have purifying or transformative effects on the human body. Modern medical knowledge makes it clear that many of these substances were not just useless, but actively harmful, and the emperor was almost certainly shortening his own life by consuming these poisonous compounds in his desperate attempt to extend it. The irony of this situation is difficult to overstate. In his desperate attempt to avoid death, the emperor was systematically poisoning himself with substances that were probably causing significant damage to his liver, kidneys, nervous system, and other vital organs. But the pursuit of immortality wasn't limited to taking mysterious pills or sending expeditions to magical islands. Qin Shi Huang also became obsessed with the idea of building monuments and structures that would ensure his eternal memory and perhaps even his eternal existence in some form. The most famous and elaborate of these projects was his tomb complex, which he began constructing almost immediately after becoming emperor, and which continued to grow in scope and ambition throughout his reign. This wasn't just a burial site or memorial. It was intended to be an entire underground empire where the emperor could continue to rule after death, complete with all the resources, personnel, and infrastructure he would need to maintain his power and authority in the afterlife. The construction of this tomb complex was one of the largest and most ambitious projects in human history up to that point. Historical records suggest that over 700,000 workers were involved in its construction at various times, including skilled craftsmen, artists, engineers, and ordinary laborers who spent decades of their lives working on this single project. The tomb was designed to be a perfect replica of the emperor's earthly domain, complete with palaces where he could hold court, administrative buildings where his officials could carry out the business of government, workshops where craftsmen could produce the goods needed to support the imperial household, and even replicas of the major rivers and seas of China, filled with mercury to simulate the flowing water that was such an important part of Chinese geography and culture. The underground empire was designed to be completely self-sufficient, with everything the emperor might need to continue ruling for eternity. Most famously, the tomb complex included thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers, each individually crafted with unique facial features, expressions, and equipment intended to serve as the emperor's army in the afterlife. These terracotta warriors, discovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well, give us just a glimpse of the incredible scale and ambition of the emperor's preparations for eternity. The warriors are organized into military formations, with infantry, cavalry, archers, and officers all represented in appropriate numbers and arrangements. Each soldier is armed with real weapons, though most of these have decayed or been stolen over the centuries. The level of detail in these figures is extraordinary, with attention paid not just to their military equipment, but also to their clothing, hairstyles, and individual facial characteristics. Archaeological evidence suggests that the terracotta army was just one part of a much larger complex that included hundreds of other figures representing civilians, officials, servants, entertainers, and others who would be needed to support the emperor's court in the afterlife. But the tomb complex was just one part of the emperor's comprehensive strategy for achieving some form of immortality. He also became increasingly paranoid about potential assassination attempts, reasoning that he needed to stay alive long enough for his alchemists and expedition leaders to discover the secret of eternal life. This paranoia led to some of the most bizarre and tragic episodes of his reign, as the emperor's behavior became more and more erratic and his treatment of those around him became increasingly harsh and unpredictable. The emperor began constantly changing his sleeping location, never staying in the same palace or residence for more than a few nights at a time. He maintained dozens of different palaces and safe houses throughout his empire, and his movements between them were kept secret from all but his most trusted guards and advisors. He traveled in a convoy of identical carriages, so that potential assassins wouldn't know which one actually contained the emperor. He employed food tasters to test everything he ate or drank, and he required multiple layers of security screening for anyone who wanted to meet with him personally. He became suspicious of everyone around him, including family members, longtime friends, and advisors who had served him faithfully for years. Any sign of disloyalty, criticism, or even insufficient enthusiasm for his goals could result in imprisonment, exile, or execution. Perhaps most tragically, his paranoia and obsession with immortality led to the systematic persecution and execution of scholars, intellectuals, and other educated individuals who questioned his beliefs, criticized his methods, or suggested that his pursuit of immortality was based on superstition rather than genuine knowledge. The most famous and devastating of these persecutions occurred in 213 BCE, when the emperor ordered what became known as the burning of books and burying of scholars. This event was triggered by criticism from Confucian scholars who argued that the emperor's pursuit of immortality was not only futile, but was also a dangerous distraction from the real work of governing the empire effectively and justly. These scholars pointed out that the enormous resources being devoted to expeditions, alchemical experiments, and tomb construction could be better used to improve the lives of the emperor's subjects through better infrastructure, education, agricultural improvements, and other practical measures. They also argued that the emperor's increasing paranoia and isolation were making it impossible for him to govern effectively, since he was cutting himself off from the very people who could provide him with accurate information about conditions throughout the empire. The emperor's response to this criticism was swift and brutal. He ordered the destruction of most books, except for practical manuals on subjects like agriculture, medicine, and engineering. Thousands of irreplaceable texts on history, philosophy, literature, and other subjects were burned in massive bonfires that destroyed much of the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of Chinese civilization. He also ordered the execution of hundreds of scholars, many of whom were buried alive in a deliberate attempt to terrorize other intellectuals into silence. This event, which came to be seen as one of the greatest intellectual tragedies of the ancient world, was justified by the emperor on the grounds that skeptical scholars were undermining his pursuit of immortality and therefore threatening this welfare of the entire empire. And his increasingly distorted worldview, if he could achieve eternal life, he could rule forever and ensure eternal peace and prosperity for his people. Therefore, anyone who questioned this goal was essentially committing treason against not just the emperor personally, but against all of China and its future welfare. The burning of books and execution of scholars represented a tragic turning point in the emperor's reign, marking the moment when his personal obsessions began to seriously damage the very empire he was supposedly trying to preserve for eternity. As the years passed and the emperor entered his 40s, his behavior became increasingly erratic, and his grip on reality became more and more tenuous. He spent more and more time in seclusion, consulting with alchemists and consuming various substances that promised to extend his life, while the day-to-day business of governing the empire was increasingly left to subordinates who were chosen more for their willingness to support his quest for immortality than for their administrative competence or wisdom. He became obsessed with omens, portents, and supernatural signs, interpreting everything from the flight patterns of birds to the behavior of his horses as messages related to his quest for immortality. He consulted with fortune-tellers, astrologers, and other individuals who claimed to be able to predict the future or communicate with supernatural beings. He also became convinced that speaking about death, or even using words associated with mortality, could somehow bring about his demise, leading to elaborate protocols in the imperial court designed to avoid any mention of death, aging, or other topics that might remind the emperor of his mortality. Courtiers learned to speak in euphemisms and coded language when discussing anything that might be related to the emperor's fears, and violating these protocols could result in severe punishment or even execution. Meanwhile, the expeditions he had sent to find the islands of immortality continued to fail to return with the promised elixir of life. Su Fu, the original expedition leader, never returned at all, and his fate remained a mystery that continues to intrigue historians and archaeologists to this day. Some scholars believe that he and his followers established settlements in what is now Japan or Korea, rather than risk returning to face the emperor's wrath without the promised elixir. Others suggest that the expedition was lost at sea or fell, victim to storms, pirates, or other hazards of long-distance ocean travel in the ancient world. Still others believe that Su Fu may have been a deliberate con artist who never intended to return and who used the emperor's resources to establish himself as a ruler in some distant land. Whatever the truth about Su Fu's fate, his failure to return with the elixir of immortality did not discourage the emperor from continuing his quest. He simply authorized more expeditions, consulted with different advisors, and tried new approaches to achieving his goal. Other alchemists and expedition leaders who had promised immortality began to fear for their own lives as their promised deadlines passed without results. Some fled the court and went into hiding, while others were executed for failing to deliver on their promises. But rather than taking these failures as evidence that immortality might be impossible to achieve, the emperor simply concluded that he hadn't yet found the right method or the right advisors, and he intensified his efforts to discover the secret of eternal life. The emperor's quest for immortality also led to some of the most ambitious and expensive construction projects in human history. In addition to his elaborate tomb complex and his contributions to the Great Wall, he ordered the construction of numerous palaces, temples, monuments, and other structures, each designed to demonstrate his power and ensure his eternal memory. One of the most impressive of these was the Apang Palace, which was intended to be the largest and most magnificent palace complex ever built, a structure so grand and imposing that it would serve as a permanent monument to the emperor's greatness and power. Historical descriptions of this palace are almost too grand to believe. It was said to be capable of housing 10,000 people comfortably, with throne rooms so large that they could accommodate thousands of courtiers at once. The main hall was reportedly over 500 meters long and 100 meters wide, with a ceiling so high that it seemed to touch the clouds. The palace was designed with elaborate gardens, artificial lakes, mechanical devices that demonstrated the emperor's mastery over the forces of nature, and countless rooms filled with treasures from throughout the empire and beyond. The construction of the Apang Palace required tens of thousands of workers and consumed enormous quantities of materials, including rare woods, precious metals, and exotic stones transported from the farthest reaches of the empire. Although the palace was never completed due to the emperor's death and the subsequent fall of his dynasty, the ruins that remained for centuries afterward gave visitors some sense of the incredible scale and ambition of the project. The palace was designed not just as a residence, but as a kind of earthly paradise, where the emperor could enjoy the pleasures and comforts of immortal life, even if he couldn't achieve actual immortality. But perhaps the most telling aspect of the emperor's quest for immortality was his increasing isolation from the very people he claimed to be trying to protect through his eternal rule. As his paranoia grew and his behavior became more erratic, he became more and more removed from the day-to-day realities of governing his empire and the lives of his subjects. Important decisions were delayed for weeks or months, while the emperor consulted with alchemists about the astrological implications of various policy choices. Competent administrators were replaced with individuals who were chosen primarily for their willingness to support the emperor's quest for immortality rather than their ability to govern effectively. The efficient bureaucracy that the emperor had established in the early years of his reign began to break down as qualified officials were purged for expressing skepticism about immortality, research, or for failing to show sufficient enthusiasm for the emperor's goals. The economic cost of the emperor's pursuits was also enormous and growing every year. The expeditions to find magical islands and immortality elixirs required vast resources, including ships, supplies, crew members, and treasure to trade with the supposed immortal beings. The construction of elaborate palaces, tomb complexes, and monuments consumed the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers and enormous quantities of materials. The maintenance of a court filled with alchemists, sorcerers, and other supposed experts in immortality required constant funding for their experiments, equipment, and living expenses. The constant movement of the imperial household from palace to a palace to avoid potential assassins required maintaining multiple residences and security forces throughout the empire. All of these costs were ultimately borne by the Chinese people through heavy taxation, forced labor, and the diversion of resources away from projects that would have improved their lives, such as better infrastructure, agricultural improvements, education, and public health measures. The emperor's subjects began to grumble about the heavy tax burden and the apparent waste of resources on projects that seemed to benefit only the emperor himself. This growing resentment created exactly the kind of instability and discontent that would eventually contribute to the downfall of the Qin dynasty shortly after the emperor's death. Despite all of these efforts, despite the millions of people whose lives were affected by his quest, despite the vast resources expended and the incredible monuments built, despite the persecution of scholars and the systematic suppression of anyone who questioned his goals, Qin Shi Huang was no closer to achieving immortality in his final years than he had been when he first began his pursuit decades earlier. If anything, the stress and anxiety created by his obsession, combined with the toxic substances he was consuming in hope of extending his life, were probably hastening his death rather than preventing it. Historical records suggest that by his late 40s, the emperor was showing clear signs of mercury poisoning and other health problems directly related to his consumption of supposed life-extending elixirs. He suffered from tremors, mood swings, memory problems, and other symptoms that are consistent with chronic heavy metal poisoning. His physical appearance had changed dramatically from the imposing figure of his youth, and those who knew him well could see that his health was declining rapidly despite all of his efforts to preserve and extend his life. The emperor's mental state was also deteriorating, as his paranoia and obsession with immortality consumed more and more of his attention and emotional energy. He had difficulty concentrating on the practical business of government, became increasingly suspicious of everyone around him, and seemed to lose touch with the reality of his situation and the needs of his empire. In 210 BCE, at the age of 49, Qin Shi Huang embarked on what would turn out to be his final journey. He was traveling on one of his regular inspection tours of his empire, still hoping to find new alchemists, magical substances, or other opportunities that might grant him the immortality he so desperately sought. The journey took him to the eastern parts of his empire, the same regions from which his expeditions to the Immortal Islands had departed decades earlier. He was traveling with a large entourage that included his personal guards, various court officials, several alchemists and advisors, and all of the equipment and supplies necessary to maintain the imperial household while away from the capital. The emperor was still actively pursuing his quest for immortality, even during this journey, consulting with local wise men and healers, investigating reports of unusual phenomena that might be related to supernatural forces, and continuing to consume the various elixirs and substances that he believed might extend his life. It was during this journey that the emperor began to show serious signs of illness that would prove to be fatal. According to historical accounts, he developed a high fever and began behaving even more erratically than usual, making strange pronouncements, seeing visions, and displaying other symptoms that suggested both physical illness and mental disturbance. Some historians believe he was suffering from the cumulative effects of mercury poisoning from the elixirs he had been consuming for years, which would have gradually damaged his nervous system, kidneys, and other vital organs. Others suggest he may have contracted a disease during his travels, possibly dysentery or another illness that was common in the ancient world and could be fatal without proper medical treatment. Still others believe that his death may have been the result of assassination, either by poisoning or other means, carried out by individuals who had grown tired of his increasingly erratic behavior and the damage his obsessions were causing to the empire. Whatever the exact cause of his illness, it became clear to those around him that the emperor was dying. As his condition worsened, those closest to him began to panic, not just because of their personal loyalty to the emperor, but also because they knew that his death would likely trigger a succession crisis that could tear the empire apart. Emperor had not clearly designated an heir, and there were several potential claimants to the throne who might try to seize power upon his death. The news of the emperor's illness was kept secret from all but the most trusted members of his inner circle, and desperate efforts were made to find some treatment or cure that might save his life. In a final tragic irony, the man who had spent decades trying to ban death found himself facing it in a remote part of his empire, far from his magnificent palaces, elaborate tomb complex, and all of the monuments he had built to ensure his eternal memory. As his condition deteriorated further, the emperor seems to have finally begun to confront the reality of his mortality and the failure of his lifelong quest for immortality. According to some historical accounts, his final days were marked by periods of lucidity, during which he expressed regret, not for the lives lost or resources wasted in his pursuit of eternal life, but for his failure to achieve the goal that had consumed so much of his energy and attention. He allegedly spent his last conscious hours giving instructions for the completion of his tomb complex and the continuation of various projects related to his quest for immortality, still hoping that future generations might succeed where he had failed. He died in his traveling palace in the late summer of 210 BCE, and his death was initially kept secret by his chief advisor, Li Si, and the powerful eunuch Zhou Gao, who feared that news of the emperor's mortality might cause immediate rebellions throughout the empire and trigger the very succession crisis they were desperate to avoid. For several weeks, they maintained the fiction that the emperor was still alive but too ill to receive visitors, while they secretly transported his body back toward the capital and made arrangements for a controlled transition of power. The irony of this deception was profound. The man who had tried to ban death was now being used in death to maintain the illusion that death could be indefinitely postponed through clever planning and careful management of information. The subterfuge became increasingly difficult to maintain as the imperial convoy made its slow journey back to the capital, particularly during the hot summer weather when the emperor's decomposing body began to produce odors that threatened to reveal the truth to the thousands of people who accompanied the imperial household on its travels. According to historical accounts, Li Si and Zhao Gao ordered that carts of fish be placed near the emperor's carriage to mask the smell of his decaying corpse, a grotesque solution that perfectly captured the absurdity of trying to hide the reality of death through elaborate deceptions and practical measures. When the news of the emperor's death was finally announced several weeks later, it triggered exactly the kind of chaos and conflict that his advisors had feared. The succession was contested by multiple claimants. The empire was plagued by rebellions and civil wars. And within just 4 years of the emperor's death, the dynasty he had founded collapsed completely, bringing an end to the political system he had created and the dream of eternal rule that had motivated so much of his later life. The aftermath of Qin Shi Huang's death revealed the ultimate futility of his quest for immortality in the most dramatic possible way. The vast empire he had unified fragmented once again into competing kingdoms and regions. Many of the monuments he had built were destroyed, abandoned, or fell into ruin. The administrative systems he had established were dismantled or significantly modified by subsequent rulers. Even his elaborate tomb complex, designed to ensure his eternal rule and protection, was broken into by rebels during the civil wars that followed his death, with much of its treasure stolen and many of its protective mechanisms destroyed or damaged. The terracotta army that was supposed to protect him in the afterlife was buried under debris and forgotten until its accidental rediscovery over 2,000 years later. The irony of the emperor's story extends far beyond the immediate aftermath of his death, however, and continues to resonate in ways that he never could have anticipated. While his quest for personal immortality failed completely and catastrophically, his legacy has indeed proven to be immortal in ways that he never imagined or intended. The unified China he created, despite fragmenting temporarily after his death, established a template and precedent for Chinese civilization that has endured for over 2,000 years and continues to influence Chinese politics, culture, and identity today. His standardization of writing, currency, weights, and measurements created foundations for Chinese culture that not only survived the fall of his dynasty, but became so fundamental to Chinese civilization that they are still in use in modified forms today. The administrative systems and bureaucratic principles he established influenced Chinese government for centuries and provided models that were adapted and refined by subsequent dynasties. Even the Great Wall, built partly as a monument to his earthly power and partly as a practical defense against northern invasions, became one of the most recognizable and enduring symbols of Chinese civilization, attracting millions of visitors from around the world and serving as a powerful reminder of China's long history and cultural achievements. In a very real sense, Qin Shi Huang achieved a form of immortality that was far more lasting and meaningful than anything his alchemists and expedition leaders could have provided. But it was immortality through historical memory and cultural influence rather than through the preservation of his physical body or the continuation of his personal consciousness. His name and story have been remembered, retold, analyzed, and debated for over 2 millennia, making him one of the most famous and influential figures in human history. The very fact that we're discussing his life and achievements today, more than 2,000 years after his death, proves that he achieved a kind of eternal life that transcends the biological limitations he spent so much effort trying to overcome. But the story of the emperor who tried to ban death also serves as one of history's most powerful cautionary tales about the dangers of obsession, the corrupting influence of absolute power, and the psychological costs of refusing to accept the fundamental constraints and limitations that define human existence. Qin Shi Huang started his career as a brilliant and effective ruler who accomplished something that no one before him had even attempted: the unification of China under a single government. His early achievements demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking, administrative skill, and visionary leadership that created institutions and systems which benefited millions of people and influenced Chinese civilization for centuries. However, his inability to accept the natural limits of human existence, particularly the inevitability of death, led him to make increasingly poor decisions that ultimately undermined his own legacy and caused immense suffering for his people. His story illustrates how even the most powerful and successful individuals can be undone by their refusal to accept fundamental aspects of the human condition, and how the pursuit of impossible goals can become so consuming that it destroys the very achievements it was meant to preserve. The Emperor's quest for immortality also reflects broader human anxieties about death, meaning, and the nature of existence that are as relevant today as they were in ancient China. In many ways, modern scientific and technological efforts to extend human lifespan, defeat aging, and enhance human capabilities can be seen as more sophisticated and scientifically grounded versions of the Emperor's quest. While we no longer send expeditions to magical islands or consume mercury-based elixirs, we do invest billions of dollars in research aimed at understanding and potentially reversing the aging process, developing technologies that could significantly extend human lifespan, and exploring possibilities for enhancing human physical and cognitive capabilities beyond their natural limits. The difference, of course, is that modern science approaches these questions through rigorous research, careful testing, and systematic investigation rather than through superstition, wishful thinking, and the exploitation of desperate hopes. Modern researchers are also generally more aware of the ethical implications of their work and more careful about the potential unintended consequences of dramatically extending human lifespan or fundamentally altering human nature. However, the underlying desire to transcend the natural limits of human existence remains remarkably similar to what motivated the ancient emperor, suggesting that his story touches on something deep and persistent in human psychology that transcends cultural and historical differences. The emperor's story also raises fascinating and troubling questions about the relationship between power and mortality that remain relevant in our contemporary world. Qin Shi Huang had achieved the ultimate earthly power of his time, ruling over millions of people and vast territories with virtually unlimited authority. Yet this power seemed to make the prospect of death even more unbearable, rather than providing comfort, satisfaction, or acceptance. Perhaps this was because ultimate power creates the illusion that all problems can be solved through sufficient force, resources, or clever planning, making the one insurmountable problem of human mortality seem like a personal failure or a challenge that simply required the right approach rather than a universal condition that must be accepted with grace and wisdom. This dynamic can be observed in many powerful individuals throughout history who have become obsessed with their own mortality and legacy, often leading them to make decisions that prioritize their personal concerns over the welfare of those they are supposed to serve. The emperor's increasing paranoia and isolation also demonstrate how the fear of death can become self-defeating and ultimately counterproductive. In his desperate attempt to avoid assassination and live long enough to achieve immortality, Qin Shi Huang cut himself off from the very experiences, relationships, and activities that make life meaningful and worth living. His final years were spent in constant fear and suspicion, surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than those who genuinely cared about his well-being or could provide him with honest counsel and genuine friendship. Became a prisoner of his own power and paranoia, unable to trust anyone completely and unable to enjoy the remarkable achievements he had accomplished. In trying to extend his life indefinitely, he arguably stopped truly living years before his actual death, trading the richness and complexity of human experience for the sterile pursuit of an impossible goal. This pattern of self-defeating behavior, driven by the fear of death, can be observed in many individuals who become so obsessed with avoiding mortality that they fail to make the most of the time they actually have. The massive resources devoted to the emperor's quest for immortality also highlight the enormous opportunity costs of such obsessions and the ways in which personal fixations can divert attention and resources away from more beneficial and achievable goals. The labor and materials used to build his elaborate tomb complex, construct the Apang Palace, and fund countless expeditions and alchemical experiments could have been used to improve the lives of his subjects through better infrastructure, educational opportunities, agricultural improvements, public health measures, and other projects that would have created lasting benefits for millions of people. The scholars who were executed for questioning his beliefs could have contributed to advances in science, philosophy, literature, and administration that would have enriched Chinese civilization and improved the welfare of future generations. The years of political instability and economic strain caused by his obsessions ultimately weakened the very empire he was trying to preserve forever and contributed to its rapid collapse after his death. This represents a tragic irony in which the emperor's attempt to ensure his eternal legacy actually damaged that legacy and shortened its duration. The story of Qin Shi Huang's quest for immortality provides valuable insights into the psychology of obsession and the ways in which fixation on a single goal can gradually distort a person's judgment, values, and behavior. The emperor's early years showed him to be a practical, strategic thinker who could balance multiple priorities and make difficult decisions based on careful analysis of costs and benefits. However, as his obsession with immortality grew stronger, he became increasingly unable to think rationally about the pursuit of this goal, or to recognize when the costs of continuing his quest outweighed any potential benefits. His judgment became clouded by wishful thinking. His decision-making became driven by emotion rather than logic, and his ability to learn from experience became compromised by his desperate need to believe that immortality was achievable. This psychological deterioration was probably exacerbated by the toxic substances he was consuming, which would have affected his cognitive function and emotional stability. But the underlying pattern of obsession, overwhelming rational thought, is something that can be observed in many individuals become fixated on goals that are either impossible or extremely difficult to achieve. The emperor's story also illustrates the importance of surrounding ourselves with people who are willing to challenge our assumptions, question our goals, and provide honest feedback about our behavior and decisions. Throughout his quest for immortality, Qin Shi Huang was constantly encouraged and supported by advisors who had vested interests in maintaining his delusions and who benefited personally from his continued pursuit of impossible goals. The alchemists who promised impossible elixirs, the expedition leaders who spun elaborate tales about magical islands, and the courtiers who praised every decision he made all contributed to his increasing disconnection from reality and his inability to recognize the futility and destructiveness of his obsessions. The scholars and advisors who might have provided him with honest counsel and helped him find more constructive ways to deal with his mortality were either executed, exiled, or intimidated into silence. A true friend or wise counselor would have helped him confront the reality of mortality in a healthy way and find meaning and satisfaction in his actual achievements rather than encouraging him to chase impossible dreams that were destroying both his personal well-being and his empire. The economic and social costs of the emperor's obsessions provide another important lesson about the responsible use of power and resources, particularly for those in positions of leadership who have the ability to affect the lives of many people. Leaders who become obsessed with personal goals at the expense of their subjects' welfare inevitably create resentment, instability, and resistance that can undermine everything they've worked to build. The heavy taxation, forced labor, and diversion of resources required to fund the emperor's quest for immortality created widespread hardship and discontent among the Chinese people, contributing significantly to the rebellions and civil wars that brought down his dynasty shortly after his death. A more balanced approach that focused on the welfare of his people and the long-term stability of his empire rather than his personal immortality might have created a more lasting and positive legacy that would have better served his stated goal of ensuring eternal peace and prosperity for China. The irony is that by pursuing personal immortality at the expense of good governance, he actually shortened the lifespan of the very empire he was trying to preserve forever. Interestingly, the emperor's quest for immortality may actually have been counterproductive, even by his own narrow standards of success. The stress, anxiety, and paranoia created by his constant fear of death, combined with the toxic substances he consumed in hope of extending his life, probably shortened his natural lifespan compared to what it might have been if he had simply accepted mortality and focused on maintaining his health through conventional means such as proper diet, exercise, rest, and stress management. This suggests that sometimes the very act of desperately pursuing a goal can make that goal less attainable rather than more so, particularly when the pursuit itself creates negative side effects that work against the desired outcome. The Emperor's story demonstrates how fear and obsession can become self-fulfilling prophecies that bring about the very outcomes they are meant to prevent. The story of Qin Shi Huang also provides valuable insights into the psychology of power and how it can distort a person's perception of reality, their relationships with others, and their understanding of their own limitations and mortality. When someone has the ability to command vast resources, have their every wish obeyed by thousands of people, and see their decisions implemented on a massive scale, it's natural for them to begin believing that they can overcome any obstacle through the application of sufficient force, wealth, or determination. The emperor's early successes in conquering rival kingdoms, unifying China, and implementing sweeping reforms probably reinforced his belief that nothing was truly impossible if he was willing to commit enough resources and energy to achieving it. This mindset served him well in his political and military endeavors, where his refusal to accept conventional limitations led to genuine breakthroughs and achievements that no one before him had accomplished. However, this same mindset became destructive and self-defeating when applied to the fundamental biological and physical constraints of human existence, which cannot be overcome through political power or military force. The emperor's inability to distinguish between problems that could be solved through human effort and those that represented unchangeable aspects of reality led him to waste enormous resources and cause tremendous suffering in pursuit of goals that were impossible from the start. The lasting fascination with the emperor's story, evidenced by countless books, movies, documentaries, television series, academic studies, and discussions like this one, suggests that his quest resonates with something deep and persistent in human nature that transcends cultural, historical, and geographical boundaries. Despite the obvious futility and destructiveness of his specific approach to achieving immortality, most people can understand and relate to the underlying desires that motivated him, the wish to avoid death, the frustration with the limitations of human existence, the desire to preserve and protect the things we value most, and the hope that sufficient knowledge or technology might eventually allow us to transcend the constraints that have limited human experience throughout history. The Emperor's story serves as a kind of universal cautionary tale that allows us to explore these fundamental themes through the extreme example of someone who had the power and resources to pursue his obsessions to their logical conclusion, showing us both the appeal and the ultimate futility of trying to escape the human condition through force of will or accumulation of power. The archaeological discoveries related to the emperor's tomb complex continue to provide new insights into his quest for immortality and its impact on Chinese civilization, technology, and culture. The terracotta warriors, discovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well, revealed not only the incredible scale and ambition of his preparation for the afterlife, but also the advanced state of Chinese craftsmanship, metallurgy, and artistic achievement during his reign. Each of the thousands of warriors was individually crafted with unique facial features, expressions, and details that demonstrate the high level of skill and attention to detail that went into their creation. More recent excavations have uncovered evidence of the elaborate systems designed to protect the tomb, including booby traps, crossbow mechanisms, and other defensive devices that were intended to prevent grave robbers from disturbing the emperor's eternal rest. Archaeological evidence has also revealed the sophisticated engineering and construction techniques used to build the underground complex, including waterproofing systems, drainage mechanisms, and structural supports that were designed to preserve the tomb and its contents for thousands of years. These discoveries help us understand not just the emperor's personal obsessions, but also the advanced state of Chinese technology, engineering, and organizational capability during his reign, providing insights into how such massive projects were planned, funded, and executed using the tools and techniques available in the ancient world. The emperor's influence on Chinese culture, philosophy, and intellectual development extends far beyond his political and military achievements and continues to shape Chinese thought and culture in ways that are still visible today. His quest for immortality contributed significantly to the development of Taoist alchemy, traditional Chinese medicine, and various philosophical traditions that emphasize the possibility of transcending normal human limitations through proper knowledge, practice, and harmony with natural forces. While many of the specific practices he promoted were harmful, useless, or based on superstition, his patronage of individuals claiming to possess secret knowledge helped establish traditions of experimentation, systematic inquiry, and documentation that eventually contributed to genuine advances in chemistry, medicine, astronomy, and other fields. Chinese alchemists and natural philosophers continued to pursue many of the same goals that had motivated the emperor, but they gradually developed more sophisticated and systematic approaches that led to important discoveries and innovations. For example, Chinese alchemists' attempts to create elixirs of life led them to discover gunpowder, develop new metallurgical techniques, and advance their understanding of chemical processes. Their systematic experimentation with different substances and techniques contributed to the development of traditional Chinese medicine, which, despite its sometimes questionable theoretical foundations, has produced effective treatments for various conditions and continues to influence medical practice in China and other parts of the world. In this sense, even the emperor's failed quest had some positive long-term consequences for Chinese civilization and human knowledge more generally. Modern China's relationship with the emperor's legacy is complex, multifaceted, and continues to evolve as Chinese society grapples with questions about its historical identity, political traditions, and cultural values. On one hand, Qin Shi Huang is widely celebrated as the founder of unified China and the creator of many institutions, traditions, and cultural practices that remain important and influential today. He is seen as a visionary leader who accomplished something that no one before him had even attempted, and his achievements in unifying diverse peoples under a single government, standardizing cultural and administrative practices, and creating lasting institutions are recognized as foundational moments in Chinese history. His tomb complex and the terracotta warriors have become powerful symbols of Chinese cultural achievement and historical depth, attracting millions of visitors from around the world and serving as sources of national pride and cultural identity. On the other hand, his authoritarianism, persecution of intellectuals, use of forced labor, and costly personal obsessions are increasingly seen as negative examples of how power can be misused and how personal ambitions can conflict with the welfare of the people. Modern Chinese scholars, writers, and intellectuals are more willing than previous generations to acknowledge and discuss the darker aspects of his reign, including the suffering caused by his massive construction projects, the intellectual damage caused by the burning of books and execution of scholars, and the way his personal fears and obsessions distorted his judgment and priorities. This more balanced and nuanced view of his legacy reflects a growing sophistication in Chinese historical analysis and a greater willingness to see historical figures as complex individuals who can be both admirable and deeply flawed at the same time, rather than as simple heroes or villains. The Emperor's story also provides a fascinating case study in how historical narratives are constructed, transmitted, and modified over time, and how different generations and cultures interpret the same events in different ways based on their own values, concerns, and perspectives. Much of what we know about his quest for immortality comes from historical records written by scholars who lived during or shortly after his reign. And these accounts were undoubtedly influenced by the political biases, cultural assumptions, and personal experiences of their authors. Some of these historians were writing during the Han Dynasty, which succeeded the Qin and had political reasons to emphasize the negative aspects of the previous regime. Others were writing from Confucian perspectives that were naturally critical of the emperor's persecution of scholars and his rejection of traditional moral and philosophical teachings. Still others were influenced by Taoist traditions that might have been more sympathetic to his pursuit of immortality, but critical of his methods and his treatment of those who disagreed with him. Over the centuries, different aspects of his story have been emphasized, downplayed, or reinterpreted based on the political and cultural concerns of different periods. And some of the more fantastic elements of his quest may have been exaggerated or embellished over time, while other aspects may have been forgotten or deliberately omitted. This reminds us that all historical narratives are interpretive constructs that reflect not just what happened in the past, but also the concerns, biases, and perspectives of those who recorded, transmitted, and interpreted those events. The international fascination with the emperor's story has made him one of the most recognizable and widely discussed figures from ancient history, comparable to other legendary rulers like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or Cleopatra. This global recognition reflects not just the inherent drama and interest of his story, but also the universal themes it addresses and the way it speaks to concerns and desires that are shared across different cultures and historical periods. People from cultures very different from ancient China can still relate to the emperor's fear of death, his struggle with the limitations of human existence, his abuse of power, his conflicts with intellectuals and advisors, and his ultimate failure to achieve his impossible goal. The story has been adapted and retold in numerous languages and cultural contexts, each adaptation emphasizing different aspects of his life and reign based on the particular interests and concerns of its intended audience. Western audiences might be particularly interested in the emperor as an example of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, while Chinese audiences might focus more on his role in creating Chinese civilization and culture. Modern audiences living in an age of rapid technological change might be particularly interested in his quest for immortality and its parallels to contemporary efforts to extend human lifespan and enhance human capabilities. This universality and adaptability suggest that his story will continue to be relevant and meaningful for future generations, regardless of changes in technology, politics, culture, or social organization. The emperor's quest for immortality can also be viewed through the lens of modern psychology and our growing understanding of human motivation, behavior, and mental health. His increasingly erratic behavior, growing paranoia, social isolation, and distorted thinking patterns are consistent with what we might expect from someone suffering from severe anxiety disorders, possibly exacerbated by mercury poisoning and other toxic effects from the substances he was consuming in his attempts to extend his life. His obsession with death and immortality might be understood as a form of thanatophobia, or death anxiety, that became so severe that it dominated his thinking and decision-making processes. His persecution of those who disagreed with him and His increasing inability to tolerate criticism or dissent might reflect the kind of cognitive rigidity and defensive thinking that often accompanies severe anxiety and obsessive behavior. This doesn't excuse his cruel and destructive actions, but it does provide some insight into the psychological processes and mental states that drove his obsessions and might help us recognize similar patterns in other historical figures, and even in contemporary leaders who become consumed by unrealistic goals or personal fears. Understanding these psychological dimensions can also help us develop better strategies for identifying and addressing similar problems before they become as destructive and harmful as they did in the emperor's case. The story of Qin Shi Huang ultimately serves as a profound reminder that even the most powerful, successful, and accomplished individuals are subject to the same fundamental constraints, limitations, and psychological vulnerabilities that govern all human existence. His failure to achieve immortality was not a personal failing or a result of insufficient effort, resources, or determination, but rather an inevitable consequence of pursuing a goal that was impossible from the start and incompatible with the basic facts of human biology and the nature of existence itself. His tragedy lies not in his failure to transcend human limitations, but in his inability to find meaning, satisfaction, and fulfillment within those limitations, and in his failure to recognize that the constraints that define human existence are not obstacles to be overcome, but fundamental aspects of what makes life meaningful, urgent, and precious. Had he been able to accept mortality as a natural and inevitable part of human existence, and had he been able to focus on the remarkable achievements he had already accomplished and the positive legacy he could have left for future generations, he might have enjoyed a more fulfilling and meaningful final chapter to his life and created a more positive and lasting impact on the world. The emperor who tried to ban death ultimately discovered that death cannot be banned, bargained with, defeated through force or wealth, or avoided through clever planning or technological innovation. But his story lives on as one of history's most powerful and enduring tales, providing valuable lessons about power, obsession, mortality, human psychology, and the importance of accepting the constraints and limitations that define human existence. In failing to achieve immortality for himself, he inadvertently achieved a different and more meaningful kind of immortality through the enduring power of his story to educate, inspire, challenge, and warn future generations about the dangers of pursuing impossible dreams at the expense of present realities and the welfare of others. His legacy serves as both a testament to human ambition and achievement and a cautionary reminder of how even the greatest accomplishments can be undermined by obsession, fear, and the refusal to accept fundamental aspects of the human condition. As we conclude this long journey through the life, achievements, and ultimate obsessions of Qin Shi Huang, it's worth reflecting on how his story continues to resonate and remain relevant in our modern world, where advances in technology and science have given us unprecedented power over our environment, our health, and even our own biology, yet where the fundamental questions about mortality, meaning, purpose, and the proper use of power remain as challenging and important as ever. We live in an age where scientists are seriously pursuing research into aging, life extension, and even the possibility of achieving some form of technological immortality through advances in genetics, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and other fields. While our methods are more sophisticated and scientifically grounded than those available to the ancient emperor, the underlying desire to transcend human limitations and defeat death remains remarkably similar to what motivated his quest over 2,000 years ago. Like the emperor, we must grapple with questions about how much time, money, and effort should be devoted to extending human lifespan versus addressing other pressing human needs, how to balance individual desires for longevity with collective welfare and social justice, and how to maintain perspective and wisdom in the face of exciting but uncertain technological possibilities. The Emperor's story reminds us that even if we develop the ability to significantly extend human lifespan or enhance human capabilities, we will still need to find meaning and purpose within whatever constraints and limitations remain, and we will still need to be careful not to let our pursuit of longevity become so consuming that it prevents us from living fully and meaningfully in the present. We can also draw important lessons from the Emperor's story about leadership, power, and responsibility that remain highly relevant in our contemporary political and social context. His early success as a unifying leader who created lasting institutions and positive change demonstrates the potential for visionary leadership to accomplish great things and benefit millions of people. However, his later descent into paranoia, obsession, and destructive behavior shows how easily even successful leaders can be corrupted by power and driven off course by personal fears and desires. His persecution of intellectuals and suppression of dissent provides a chilling example of how leaders who become convinced of their own infallibility can do enormous damage to the very societies they claim to be protecting. His willingness to sacrifice the welfare of his people for his personal goals serves as a warning about the dangers of leadership that prioritizes individual ambitions over collective needs. These lessons are particularly important in an era when political polarization, the concentration of wealth and power, and the complexity of global challenges require wise, humble, and selfless leadership that can balance competing interests and maintain focus on long-term collective welfare rather than short-term personal or political gains. The Emperor's story also speaks to broader questions about human nature, the search for meaning and purpose, and the ways we cope with uncertainty, limitation, and mortality that are as relevant today as they were in ancient China. His obsession with immortality can be seen as an extreme example of the human tendency to try to control and master aspects of existence that are fundamentally beyond our control. And his ultimate failure serves as a reminder that acceptance and wisdom are often more valuable than ambition and determination. His isolation and paranoia illustrate the importance of maintaining genuine relationships and staying connected to other people and to reality, even when we achieve great success or accumulate significant power. His persecution of those who disagreed with him demonstrates the dangers of surrounding ourselves only with people who tell us what we want to hear, and the importance of seeking out diverse perspectives and honest feedback. His inability to find satisfaction in his remarkable achievements shows how the pursuit of impossible goals can prevent us from appreciating and enjoying what we have already accomplished. These insights remain valuable for anyone struggling with questions about purpose, success, mortality, and how to live a meaningful and fulfilling life in the face of uncertainty and limitation. Finally, the endearing fascination with the Emperor's story and the fact that we're still discussing and learning from his life over 2,000 years after his death provides perhaps the most important lesson of all, that true immortality comes not from preserving our physical bodies or extending our individual lives indefinitely, but from contributing something of lasting value to the world, creating positive change that benefits others, and leaving behind a legacy that continues to educate, inspire, and influence future generations long after we're gone. The Emperor achieved this kind of immortality despite himself, through the very failures and flaws that he would have wanted to hide or overcome. His story continues to teach us important lessons about power, leadership, human nature, and the Korea search for meaning precisely because it shows us both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human folly, both the potential for greatness that exists within human ambition and the dangers that arise when that ambition becomes disconnected from wisdom, humility, and concern for others. In the end, the emperor who tried to ban death discovered that while death itself cannot be banned, the impact of a life well lived The influence of important ideas and achievements, and the power of a compelling story to teach and inspire others, can indeed last forever, creating a form of immortality that is more meaningful and valuable than anything his alchemists could have provided, and reminding us that our own legacy will ultimately be determined not by how long we live, but by how well we live and what we contribute to the ongoing human story of which we are all a part.